All right, welcome everybody. You are listening, watching the Yaron Brook Show, and thanks for joining us. And if somebody can go on my Facebook page and say, "Hey guys, go to YouTube," that would be great. If you could post a link, that would even be better, because for some reason right now it's not connecting to Facebook. I have no idea why. I assume it's a problem with Restream or a problem with Facebook. The settings are all the same as they usually are. All right, we are going to start today. We're going to do a news briefing, so we're going to go over a few stories in the news, and in particular, I want to cover an economic story that is a story of Turkey. What's going on in Turkey? It's been in the news. There's a lot of panic, a lot of distress with regard to what is happening in Turkey. We can talk about that. And then beyond that, I'd like to, we will cover a couple of other stories. I want to say one more thing about Facebook and Alex Jones. And I know a lot of you are probably tired of Facebook and Alex Jones, but I want to cover one more issue that people have raised, and maybe some comments that Jordan Peterson made about this whole situation. So I thought that would be good. And then particularly religion. I want to talk about a specific religion that seems to be abusive towards children, and whose practitioners seem to be, with very little criticism and very little objection and very little consequences, seem to be particularly, there's a word that I'm missing, but abusing children sexually with very little consequences. So that's in the news today as well. So I want to talk about that. But let's start with Turkey, because I think this is an interesting story. I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. To a large extent, because I think this is the crisis in Turkey right now is to a large extent the consequence of our bad economic policy, globally bad economic policy over a long period of time. And I think Turkey is feeling it. And I think what you will see is that there's real potential for this crisis in Turkey to expand well beyond Turkey, to expand to other developing economies, and ultimately to come back and hurt the US economy and the European economy as well. This could be part of the trigger for the recession I have been warning you against. It's hard to tell exactly. It's often hard to tell what the triggers of these things will be. But certainly what's going on in Turkey is interesting. It's interesting economically, and it's interesting in terms of some of the consequences of what central bankers did after the financial crisis. So to really understand what is going on today, we have to understand kind of the consequences of the financial crisis. And what's going on right now is really an extension of the financial crisis. And indeed, the next recession will be a recession that's real consequence. The real trigger for was the 2008 financial crisis, or the behavior of central bankers and the behaviors of others within the economy to the financial crisis that hit us in 2008. So what is going on in Turkey? Well, it's what fundamentally is going on right now is that Turkey is losing a massive, its currency is declining dramatically against the dollar. So the dollar is gaining in strength. The dollar globally has gained in strength versus many currencies. But in the case of Turkey, the Turkish lira has lost more than 40% of its value against the dollar just this year. And it's lost 70% of its value versus the dollar since this crisis began a couple of years ago. So what we're seeing is the lira is in massive decline. The dollar relative to the lira is in ascent. The dollar is getting stronger and stronger. The lira is getting weaker and weaker. As a consequence of that, it turns out that many businesses who borrowed money in dollars cannot pay back their debts. The big risk that we're facing in the weeks and months to come is significant bankruptcies of large Turkish businesses. And Turkey is a big economy. Turkey is not it's not a trivial economy. It's an economy that for many years the European Union wanted to bring into the European Union and to embrace as part of the European Union, because it's an important economy. And it has businesses in Turkey going under, not being able to pay back their debts, is going to have consequences, because they took out loans in dollars. Then who did they borrow from? Well, they borrowed from American and European banks. They borrowed from international banks. They didn't borrow from, if you borrow from Turkish banks, you borrow in lira, in the local denomination. But if they borrowed in dollars, then they borrowed from international banks. If they borrowed from international banks and they can't repay those loans, then that is a hit that the international banking system takes. American banks will take a hit. European banks will take a hit. It's not clear yet the level of exposure, but 25% of all the debt in Turkey, or at least all the foreign denominated debt in Turkey, is in the hands of U.S. investors. So U.S. investors have the potential to take a major hit. You know, and that there's a spiral effect. You know, it hits U.S. investors. Their profitability is lower. They have less capital. There are consequences to them. You know, if a major European bank is struggling here, that means the European Central Bank has to intervene to protect it. And again, this thing has consequences above and beyond. It's a little bit like the crisis in Greece in 2011, and it has the potential to destabilize particularly European, but in this case, because so much of the debt is in dollar terms, it has the ability to destabilize American markets as well, not just European markets. So it's an important crisis. In addition, Turkey is a NATO member. It is an ally, I put in quotes, of the United States. And yet, Turkey is ruled by an authoritarian, semi-dictator who just won an election and want to change the constitution of Turkey, which gives him extraordinary additional powers. So gives him special powers above and beyond what you would expect of a democratically elected president. Erdogan in Turkey is very close to being a dictator or certainly an authoritarian. And that complicates things. We'll see how it complicates it financially, but it also complicates it politically. Here you've got a NATO member that is basically a dictatorship. Almost all NATO members have been and are free countries or relatively free countries. And so Turkey is an exception. Turkey, not only is Erdogan an authoritarian, a almost dictator, but he is also an Islamist. He believes strongly in the role of Islam in politics, that Islam needs to play a substantial role in Turkish politics, that that Islam needs to be supported around the world. He was a huge supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood around the world. One of the reasons he was pro the insurgents, the revolutionaries, or what's the right term there? The people trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, is because those were primarily Muslim Brotherhood, and he wanted Syria to become more of an Islamist country and an ally to Turkey. So Turkey is this tricky country because it's a member of NATO. It's run by an authoritarian Islamist. Now, he's not yet at a point where he is willing to be an Islamist who is going to war with the West, because he still pretends to be the West's ally. And much of Turkish society is Westernized because of its history. But that's the direction he's heading. He's heading towards a direction of greater and greater role for religion in Turkish life, greater and greater importance of religion in all affairs of Turkey, and a commitment more and more to Islam. And as a consequence, he might not, in a sense, pull the trigger towards Turkey being an enemy of the West and Turkey supporting terrorism and Turkey being engaged in jihad against the West. But who knows? Once you elevate religion in that way, who is going to be his heir? Where's Turkey going to head? Is it going Is there going to be a backlash back towards a secular society, which Turkey had for much of its post-World War I history? Or is the trend towards greater and greater role of religion in Turkish life going to increase to the point where it becomes a leader in the jihadi movement against the West? I don't know. Hard to tell. The more we embolden Erdogan, the more likely it is to become more and more Islamic. On the other hand, the fact that Turkey is going through an economic crisis right now is going to discredit Erdogan quite a bit. So there is a chance that the good outcome of this economic crisis will be that the Turkish populace will turn its back to Erdogan, maybe go back to its more secular attitudes that dominated really Turkish politics until Erdogan's rise in the early 2000s. So hard to tell, but but it's the fact is that this crisis could have multiple consequences. Some of them positive, but many of them negative, economically probably negative. I want to talk about how Turkey got into this crisis and how it's probably going to play out. So you can ask questions about this. We'll start about Turkey and then about anything else. And on Super Chat on YouTube. So that's a way to support the show. And it's a way to get your questions a high priority. And it's a way to engage me by contributing money to the show by Super Chat on YouTube. So feel free to do that. And I will try to answer all your questions on the Super Chat. So there are a number of things going on with Turkey that are kind of interesting from this economic global perspective. So first, when the United States and Europe basically bailed out their banking systems and bailed out their economies to some extent by dramatically lowering interest rates to zero in the case of the United States, to negative interest rates in the case of Europe, it became very lucrative for emerging markets, countries like Turkey, and Turkey did this more than any other economy in the world, to borrow money in dollars because interest rates were so low on the dollars. They could get very, very good deals. They could get business loans for 5%, 6% when interest rates in lira, in the local Turkish currency, were far higher. And this was a phenomena that happened not just in Turkey, but everywhere. It's a phenomena of artificially keeping interest rates very, very low, making the cost of money very, very cheap. And in this case, because it was the US central bank that was, in a sense, flooding the world with dollars, thus keeping dollar interest rates very low, that people all over the world started borrowing money in dollars. Now, what does it mean to borrow money in dollars? It means that when you pay back, you get the money in dollars, right? So let's say you get $1 million back. And then what you do is you turn around and you have to pay salaries. You have to buy plant and equipment. You're going to build stuff. You are expanding your economy. You took this loan in dollars, which means that the interest you're going to pay on the loan is going to be in dollars. So on $1 million, the interest of 5% is $50,000. Let's say $50,000 a year you have to pay now. And when you took the loan, $1 was equal, and again, I'm making this up a little bit, 1 lira. So for every dollar that you got, you turned around, you bought 1 million lira for the $1 million you got. And then you took that 1 million lira and you hired people and you bought plant and equipment and so on. Now, every time you have to pay the loan back, you have to pay interest or principal on the loan, you have to go back into the foreign currency markets in Turkey. And you have to exchange the lira that you're getting from all this economic activity. Let's say you're running a very profitable business and it's making money in lira, and you're taking some of that money and you're paying back the loan. But when you pay back the loan, you have to convert it back into dollars. And if now the value of the lira has gone down by 50%, or the value of the dollar, in other words, has gone up by 100%. Then to repay a loan of $1 million, which used to be equal to 1 million lira, now to repay a loan of $1 million, you have to pay back 2 million lira because your currency has halved in value. That's why it's so stupid for a business to borrow money in one currency and spend it in a different currency, and then have to return, when you return the money, you have to return it back into the other currency. In other words, what the business is doing is speculating on the fact that the currency won't change, or that its domestic currency, in this case the lira, will actually go up in value. And then it's a great deal, because then you're paying your loan back with depreciated dollars. I hope this isn't over people's heads, right? So, you know, feel free to ask questions. All it takes is $1 to ask a question, $2, $10. I hope I'm not boring you to death, but this is important stuff. You cannot understand the news. You cannot understand why it is that Turkey is in such trouble without understanding this fact that if you borrow in dollars but spend in lira, you are in trouble if the value of your currency depreciates. Now, this has happened over and over and over again around the world where businesses do this. Now, if you're a smart businessman and you want to take advantage of the low interest rates in dollars, then what you should do is what companies who use things like oil do, companies who rely on agriculture do. You use financial markets to hedge your risk, to protect you. Now, again, I don't want to get overly technical with you guys, but what you do is use a futures contract. And what it looks like, amazingly, Turkish businessmen didn't do is hedge. So a hedge basically says that you make a deal with somebody else, and you say, I am willing to buy dollars from you a year or two into the future at the exchange rate that it exists today, right? And if the exchange rate changes, then one of us wins and one of us loses. But the way to do this right is to do it in a way that anything I lose on the exchange rate on the loan, I make back on this futures contract in the future. And again, I'm not trying to get you into understanding futures and everything. The point is, you can hedge these kind of risks, but many people in a country like Turkey, the economy is growing. There's a lot of confidence. You've got an authoritarian president who is cocky and confident, and the economy has grown terrifically in the last 20 years. It's a high growing economy, and you're going, there's no risk here. We're fine. I don't need to hedge my risks. And they go out and they take these loans in dollars, and the exact opposite happens. Because what happens when you have an authoritarian as president? They start intervening more and more and more in economic policy. They start intervening more and more and more in the so-called independent central bank. And Erdogan, the almost dictator of Turkey, has constantly berated the central bank about raising interest rates, constantly demanded that the central bank reduce interest rates. By the way, I think Donald Trump has done the same thing. He has been talking constantly about the idea of the Federal Reserve shouldn't increase interest rates. Put aside whether that makes sense or not, it's not the job of the president at all to make those kind of statements. But Erdogan has done the same thing. But Erdogan has a lot more power than Trump has domestically. And therefore, Erdogan has basically stopped the Turkish central bank from raising interest rates, stopped the Turkish central bank from actually reducing the amount of money in circulation. As a consequence, Turkey is running a 16% inflation rate. Money is incredibly cheap in Turkey. Well, if you consider 17% interest rates, but that's cheap when inflation is 16%. Everything is down. And as a consequence, you're getting this implosion right now. And as the dollar gets stronger, Turkey is going to get into more and more difficulties. And not only Turkey, you're going to see a problem around the world. Of course, as the dollar gets stronger, what also happens? What happens when the dollar gets stronger vis-a-vis other currencies around the world? Because somebody says, Trump's doing a great job, so the dollar's soaring. But what is the consequence of the dollar soaring? One of the consequences of the dollar soaring, for example, is the trade deficit is going to explode. That is, it's becoming more and more expensive for the Chinese. Put aside tariffs. Ignore tariffs for a minute. It's becoming more and more expensive for the Chinese to buy American goods. And it's becoming cheaper and cheaper for Americans to buy Chinese goods because the dollar is getting more valuable, which allows people with dollars to buy more and more stuff. So one of the things that's happening is the trade deficit is larger than I think as a percentage of GDP, maybe larger. It's larger. Well, it's larger right now than it's been in many years. I think it's larger than when Trump took office. It's larger than it was in January. It's exploding. It's exploding because the dollar's strong. So in spite of the tariffs, the dollar offsets the effects of the tariffs by making it easy and cheap for Americans to buy foreign goods. Just to put aside the whole trade issue. So Turkey has got a real problem. And as I said, one of the problems is that other emerging markets have also borrowed in dollars. And a lot of people are sitting around waiting for the shoe to drop to figure out who's next after Turkey. The problem is that as Turkey defaults on its debts, other countries, there'll be a contagion effect. Other businesses are going to default around Europe and ultimately the United States. On top of that, as the country descends into what's possibly economic chaos, Erdogan is likely to take on more and more power and becoming more and more dictatorial. And my guess is revert more and more to his Islamic roots and become more and more antagonistic towards the United States. By the way, Trump just dramatically increased tariffs on Turkey, which is devastating for Turkey in this case. Not particularly good for America either, but devastating for Turkey because, again, they're already having it very difficult to export to the US because they can't buy enough dollars. So they can't buy from the US. And now, it's even less so because of the tariffs. Goods are going to become more and more expensive, going to become irrelevant in the marketplace. We as consumers in the US will suffer, but so are the businesses in Turkey. Tariffs are typically lose-lose propositions. So I'm not saying that the economic sanctions are unjustified given what Erdogan has become and what Erdogan is doing. He's jailed an American, suggesting that this American was involved in a coup against him. One of the things that Erdogan did, is just done, I think, yesterday, was he started going after. Yes, this was yesterday. Started going after social media. This is exactly what authoritarians do. They start attacking free speech. He said they are economic terrorists on social media. People talking down the lira, talking up the dollar. People demanding that the central bank in Turkey raise interest rates. And he considers that economic terrorism. And he wants to prosecute those people. There are now 300 and something people, 346 social media accounts that carried posts about exchange rates and that he views as having created a negative perception of the Turkish economy. And as a consequence, he is going to take legal action against them. There go free speech in Turkey completely. And again, this is kind of a model. So watch this. because other countries are going to do the same, right? I wouldn't be surprised if there was a recession in the US, the Fed got blamed by Trump, and maybe even social media got blamed. Who knows? I mean, we live in a new world in which if people in social media feeding the recession in terms of being pessimistic about it, people like Peter Schiff are saying, oh, it's imminent, buy gold, get out, Trump is a disaster. That Trump goes after social media as a cause of the recession. And that would be very, very bad. Right. Somebody is asking, should be a super chat, guys. If you really want to ask a question, just $1. It doesn't cost that much. Just $1 and I'd answer your question, right? But is there a scenario where tariffs are useful? No. Zero scenarios in which tariffs are useful. You want to embargo a country, you want to ban a country's products, fine, if you have a rational excuse to do it. You want to sanction certain types of transactions, like we're doing with Russia, fine. Tariffs are just a stupid way of doing it. And a bad economic way of doing it, and ultimately a bad political way of doing it. So no, there is never a scenario in which tariffs are useful. You're concerned, I know this comes up all the time and I keep answering it, but people keep raising it. You're concerned about property rights in China, about them stealing IP. Then don't allow stolen products into the United States. Very simple. Very, very simple. All right, so major crisis in Turkey. It's worth watching, not because Turkey matters that much to the United States, but it's worth watching in terms of seeing if this has a contagion effect and whether it ripples across the world and whether ultimately this could be a trigger for bad things happening in the, in the United States, in Europe, and a trigger for global economic slowdown. By the way, the whole global economy is slowing down, and I expect the US to follow. I don't think there's been a delinking between the US economy and the rest of the global economy. I expect as the global economy slows, and it already is slowing, its emerging markets are slowing, Europe is slowing, China is significantly slowing. That's not a good thing. Economics is not a realm in which somebody else's loss is your gain. Economics is a realm in which what you want to create is win-win relationships. When China slows down, that is bad for the US. It's good for the US when China is booming. And it's good for China when the US is booming. And I expect the US to start slowing down probably already this quarter, but certainly in the final quarter of the year and going into next year. I don't expect this so-called fantastic Trump economy to continue. People forget that even Obama had 4 quarters of 4% plus GDP growth. So it's not that unusual to get 1 quarter of 4% GDP growth. Is it sustainable? I'm dubious. So we will see. I mean, maybe you'll get one other 4% growth, although I doubt it. I think it'll drop to closer to 3%. And then I think you'll start seeing a slowdown from there. Jennifer asks, can you compare Turkey to Greece? Yes, but there's similarities, but there are also substantial differences. One difference is that Greece was already on the euro. And as a consequence, Greece was borrowing euros. But it was also earning income in euro. So in that regard, it was easier for Greece to pay back its debts because they didn't have to convert a local currency into a foreign currency. Everything was in the local currency. The major problem in Greece, which is different from Turkey, is that most of the borrowing was done by government, and that the government was borrowing like crazy, and that the Greek economy, the Greek private economy, was unbelievably unproductive. And that most of the problems were with government debt, and that the government was subsidizing a very lax Greek lifestyle in which people didn't work and didn't produce and didn't create. A huge welfare state, massive numbers of government employees, lucrative pension plans, all kind of stuff like that. Whereas in Turkey, the government is nowhere near as big as Greece was. Government borrowing is not the main problem. It is private borrowing. It is private companies that are borrowed in a different currency from what they gain revenue from. And as a consequence, what you're likely to see is private companies go bankrupt. Now, Erdogan could try to bail those companies out, but the problem with that is, how is he going to do that? If he provides them more and more local currency that they can then exchange for dollars so that they can pay back the debt, that is going to put more and more pressure on the local currency to depreciate. It's going to put on more and more inflationary pressures on the currency, and it just creates a continuous spiral. But the focal point of the Turkish crisis is in the private sector, and it has inflation, whereas the focal point of the Greek crisis was in government borrowing, and they didn't have inflation because they were on the euro. The great advantage of being on the euro is you don't have inflation, or at least they've never really had price inflation because the euro has been managed so that there's very little inflation, at least so far. We'll see how long that is indeed sustainable. I think that answers your question. Greece also, because it was on the euro, because all the debt that was given to the Greek government was primarily held by European banks, and because Greek banks owned a huge amount of money to European banks and to European central banks, Europe bailed Greece out. That is, Germany basically bailed Greece out, and the European Central Bank bailed the Greek banks out. Now, there's a lot of reasons why all of that was stupid and badly handled and badly managed, and a lot of the Greek problem is nationalism. Why are they Greek banks? Greeks shouldn't have any banks. If there truly is a European Union, that there shouldn't be local banks. They shouldn't be country-specific banks. All banks should be pan-European. And then you get rid of a lot of the problems that we're talking about, because those pan-European banks are less likely to lend money to the local government. They're going to be much more rigorous about being financially rigorous about the ability of the local government to actually repay the debts. It's actually it being sound. So in Turkey's case, Europe is not going to bail them out. So because Europe's not going to bail them out, it's a different scenario and probably bigger problem for Turkey. They don't have the Germans just writing checks. Now we'll see. Again, Turkish economy in terms of production is in much better shape than the Greek economy was in terms of production. Okay, do you think there will be more QE in the US before the contraction in the money supply? There's already, QE is already being unwound. So a lot of the balance sheet, so QE is when the government was buying huge quantities of bonds in the private markets and in the government markets and holding them on the balance sheet, thus sending money into the private economy. But what was happening with that money is that money was then held on reserve by the banks. And that's why we never got price inflation in the United States, because the two effects canceled each other out. On the one hand, you had the Fed printing money and pushing it into the economy. On the other hand, the banks were sucking money out of the economy and putting it into into reserves at the Federal Reserve. So the net effect was very little money was actually entering into the economy. So there was actually not that much increase in money in the economy itself. What the Fed is doing right now is it's reducing the reserves that the banks hold at the Fed, and although it keeps increasing interest rates on those reserves. So I'm not sure how effective this is. They want to reduce the reserves, and at the same time, they are selling bonds into the market, which means sucking money out of the US economy. Quite a balancing act to do all that. I don't think the Fed can pull it off. And I think this will ultimately be the trigger for the US recession, is the Fed's mismanaging of this whole process. Do I think we will return to QE? Yes. When we hit the next recession, QE will be the mechanism to get us out of that recession. They will lower interest rates, but in addition, they will engage in QE. Now that it's been established that QE is kind of a legitimate way in which to deal with these kind of crises, I would not be surprised if that's what they did. So hopefully that answers the question. Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay. A few other issues. Glenn Martin okay. No question though associated with the super chat. All right. Just some other things from the news. And of course, if you have more questions about Turkey, feel free to ask them. And I mean, again, I would have kicked Turkey out of NATO a long time ago. I think the US shouldn't be in NATO. I would have also retracted a lot of support that we give Turkey a long time ago because of the nature of Erdogan, because of the nature of their Islamist tendencies, right? Now, one other story I wanted to cover quickly. I won't spend a lot of time on this, just to mention it. And that is a story that broke today from, let's see, I think it was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania's Attorney General just released the results of a grand jury investigation into sexual abuse of children, where there were 300 predators, over 1,000 victims. Now, what this immediately reminded me of are those rape gangs in England, which groomed young girls and raped young girls in large numbers in different towns in England. Rape gangs that were run by Muslims, primarily from Pakistan, but almost all Muslims. And, horrific, just disgusting, horrific. And of course, everybody, once the stories broke, everybody accused the US government for hushing this up, for not going after them because they were Muslims, which I think was true, for, this is an example of the barbarity of Islam, and this is all Muslim and Islam, and this is, horrible, and so on. And it is, all of that is true, right? And accusing all Muslims of being a problem, but accusing these gangs and accusing the government of not prosecuting this fully because they were afraid of being viewed as racist or so-called Islamophobic or whatever it is. All of that is true. And so many people on the right in particular have made that case and gone after these people, and it's been, it's made the news, and particularly on the right, right? This is a big issue for the right. But yet, this Pennsylvania Attorney General, 300 predators, over 1,000 victims, is talking about the Catholic Church. We're talking about 301 predator priests. We're talking about at least 1,000 victims just in Philadelphia. We're talking about rape gangs all over the United States, if not all over the world, which the Catholic Church has been responsible for and has covered up for at least 70 years. And yet, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Doesn't make the news. It's a little item somewhere. The Vatican, all these Catholics still remain Catholics. Nobody's pissed off. Nobody goes after the Catholic Church. Why are these gangs any different? And of course, the government doesn't do anything. Why? Because they don't want to be perceived as anti-religious. The same thing. Again, the same thing. So this is not unique to Islam. This might be unique to religion. So check it out. I saw the story on, where did I see the story? in the Huffington Post of all places, but it's all over the press. Attorney General of Pennsylvania has just issued a report, sex abuse of 300 predator priests over 70 years, 1,000 victims, 884-page report. Of course, this is the largest, most comprehensive investigation. Why is this the largest, most comprehensive investigation? We know this was going on in Boston for years and years and years, including a cover-up by the mayor, a cover-up by the police. This is exactly like those Muslim gangs that was covered up by the police and covered up by politicians and covered up by everybody. And where's the outrage here? Why isn't this front page news? Why aren't people abandoning the Catholic Church? Why aren't people condemning the Catholic Church? Why aren't people condemning the Pope? Where's the right? The right that is so eager to go after Islam. I'm all for going after Islam, but then go after Catholicism too. Because in this case, there's very little difference. And the leadership of the Catholic Church covered this up, moved priests from parish to parish, let them keep on molesting boys and girls, I guess primarily boys. And the Vatican knew about this. Popes knew about this. Those representatives of God who speak directly to God, they knew about this and they covered it up. These paragons of morality. You go tell Prager that religion is the source of morality. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. It's disgusting and it's despicable. And where's Prager talking about this? Where's the Tony Robinson of American culture talking about this? All right, there was a paid question that I missed. All right, I'll get to it in a minute. Let me finish my rant on the Catholic Church. I mean, and this is not new. This has probably been going on for 2,000 years and probably been covered up for 2,000 years. And I want to see the outrage. I want to see the right wing take this on just like they take the Muslims on. I want to see the Catholic Church disappear because any church that allows its priests, that cover up the behavior of its priests who are molesting children, should not exist on the face of this earth. Catholicism should go away. Yeah, not all religions are the same. Maybe. But it looks like in terms of molesting children, there's a lot of similarity between some people in Islam and the Catholic Church. Not some people within the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church. This was at the highest level. This was priests. These weren't practitioners. These were the priests. And they should all go to jail, including the Pope, if the Pope covered it up, including all those highfalutin cardinals, right? The cardinal that was responsible for the cover up in Boston escaped Boston, went to the Vatican, stayed in the Vatican, and never got prosecuted and never went to jail and died over there, which again is disgusting. And where are the voices talking about this? Where is the outrage? 1,000 victims. All right. I don't know why the rant is a bit off. Maybe it's a bit moderate, but all right, let me go back to the question I missed. So the question is, as individuals, what should we do to protect ourselves from the upcoming downturn? And what can we do as individuals to help stop situations like what is going on in Turkey? There's very little as individuals we can do to stop situations like in Turkey. I mean, what we need to do is help establish a better economic policies in the United States. Remember, it was zero interest rate economic policies in the US and in Europe that led to the low interest rate dollar-denominated loans that became so attractive to all these countries, all these people in all these countries. Now, it's no excuse. They still shouldn't have taken out the loans because they should have known that they were taking on exchange rate risk, which is can be devastating and which they cannot control unless they go into the future markets and protect themselves, which it doesn't look like they did. So they have to take on responsibility. But the fact is that the global economy, the whole approach to solving the financial crisis has led to this new crisis. So we as individuals can prevent that from happening again by fighting the statist economic policies of Bush, Obama, Trump. That's what we can do. And then what can you do as individuals to protect yourself against the downturn? I mentioned this a little bit yesterday. I think one is to evaluate how safe you think your job is. If you don't think it's safe, if there's a downturn, you might lose your job, then you should think about putting money aside, start saving money, putting it aside just in case you get unemployed until you look for another job. Now you can get unemployment insurance, so-called insurance, unemployment welfare from the government. And that's fine, but you don't want to just rely on that. You want to have some money in cash, not in investment, but in cash to help you survive the downside, right? The what happens if you lose your job. You want to be careful. I mean, I don't give specific investment advice, so I want to be careful here. But you want to be conservative in terms of how much money you might have in stocks right now. Stocks have gone up a lot since Obama became president, since 2009, and you might want to trim it back a little bit, right? So you want to be cautious on the extent to which you're totally exposed to the stock market. I wouldn't be in bonds because I don't know where bonds are going. It really depends on where inflation is going, and that's hard to tell. Right now, inflation's high. Price inflation, CPI inflation is 2.9%. That's high for America these days. That's pretty high. I would keep the money in dollar-denominated paper. You know, as bad as inflation's going to get. You know, if you can get into inflation-protected bonds, it's not a bad thing to be. But again, I think you want to be liquid with the money you're saving for a downturn. Now, I don't know how bad this downturn is going to be. I don't want to scare you. I don't want everybody selling everything they have. You might want to, generally, I always think that you want to have a certain percentage of your assets in gold because just as a protection against inflation, as a counter-cyclical type thing. But again, we could have a recession without inflation, and then gold will not go up or might go off a little while and then come down, and timing the market is very difficult. So generally, just be cautious. If you're worried about your job, generally, think about retraining, think about jobs that will survive the recession. Think about recession is a good time to retrain. If you lose your job, it's a good time to figure out what next, and you want to plan for that as much as you can in advance, I guess would be my point. All right. I mean, those of you interested in economics and money, I think the best books on money and economics generally were written by Ludwig von Mises. They're hard, they're not necessarily easy to read, but they are the best. So look him up. Human Action, if you can skip the first 70 pages, the pages on praxeology. Let me look and see if I can get you a recommendation list of books in economics. Let me do that, and I'll get back to you with a recommended list of books on economics for those of you interested. If you're interested in finance, then I would definitely encourage you to listen to my investment course that I did 20 years ago that's available in the eStore. And I will be releasing on YouTube, but is already available as a podcast, my In Defense of Financial Markets course, which covers a lot of these issues related to financial markets and how financial markets work and so on. And I'll be releasing that on YouTube in audio only in the weeks to come. So look for that if you're interested in those kind of things. All right, I quickly wanted to cover one more issue that relates to Alex Jones and Facebook. So this is an argument I have heard recently. Oops, what happened? And I just saw a video about this, I guess, today. So I wanted to address this. And this is the reasoning by which people want to regulate Facebook and so on. So here's the idea. The New York Times can be sued for libel because they hire the reporter, they edit the story, they decide which stories to publish and which stories not to publish. So in a sense, They are placing their credentials behind the piece that is being published. It is a publication of the New York Times. And therefore, you can sue the New York Times for libel. You don't just sue the reporter, right? Facebook and Twitter and Google have been excluded from libel laws because the argument goes, they don't curate the material. They don't choose it. They publish everything. So when somebody publishes something that's libelous, you can't go after Facebook because they had no involvement in that getting published. You can only go after the people who actually wrote the thing. Now the argument goes, and I've seen this from Jordan Peterson, I've seen this from many other people, and very dangerous argument, and it's an argument for regulating all platforms. The argument is, but if the platform starts saying, we're publishing this content, but we're not publishing that content, then the argument goes, they become like the New York Times. Now they're curating the information. They're choosing which to publish and which not, and therefore they should be liable for libel. Libel law should apply to them. Now that is ridiculous. That is just silly. I'm not a lawyer, but that just strikes me right off the bat as silly. The New York Times hires a reporter. Facebook doesn't hire reporters. The New York Times literally edits the pieces. Yes, it rejects some pieces and accepts other pieces, but that's a minor part of all of its activities. The New York Times or all publishing organizations, news organizations, when they put out a piece, is it under their name? Facebook is saying, we're a platform. We're a platform, we don't accept porn. That doesn't make you a publisher. We don't accept what we define, they define as hate speech. Doesn't make them a publisher. The fact that they're excluding content does not mean they're editing content. It does not make the content theirs. I don't think this would stand up for 1 minute in front of even any Supreme Court, even the Supreme Court. So it's a ludicrous argument to say because they're excluded from libel, they should be excluded from libel. They are not publishers. Then as soon as they curate material, the argument goes they become publishers, and therefore we should be able to sue them for libel, or we get to control what the platform actually does, which is make it neutral. That's ridiculous. That is taking one part of what publishing is involves, excluding stuff, not approving stuff, excluding stuff, and turning that into the whole issue of publishing. No, publishing is about much more than just the exclusion. It's about editing, and it's about putting your name behind it. It's about marketing the product. It's about, this is your content. That's true for book publishing. That's true for newspapers. That's true for all these things. Again, if you want to ask questions, use the super chat. That's the way to ask a question. Now, so that's ridiculous. Somebody asks, and I covered this 2 days ago with Amy, is this censorship? No, censorship is an act of government. Censorship is about force. Private institutions can limit your speech. Private institutions can limit what you write, but that is not censorship. When a newspaper rejects an editorial, I get rejected all the time. That's not censorship. When the Wall Street Journal doesn't want to publish objectivist op-eds, that's not censorship. When the New York Times doesn't want to do it, that's not censorship. That's bizarre. That's a private platform choosing what can be on the platform, what can't be on the platform. Or a publisher. When my book publisher says to me, no, we're not going to publish your book, that's not censorship. That's them making a business decision that it's not profitable for them to publish my book. Facebook made a business decision that it's not consistent with the kind of environment they want to create on Facebook to publish Alex Jones. Now, Jordan Peterson today made the argument, I don't know if today, maybe yesterday, I saw it today, that this is really bad. that this is going to destroy Facebook, because now Facebook is going to be in the business of choosing what content to put in its platform. And this is disastrous for its business model. And they don't know what they're doing, and they're crazy. Now, with all due respect to Jordan Peterson, did he predict Facebook would be as successful as it is? Did he invest in the startup? I mean, give me a break. I mean, I love it when philosophers, psychologists, intellectuals tell businesses how to run their business. Give them business advice. Really? Maybe this is a bad decision by Facebook. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a brilliant decision by Facebook. I don't know. I don't pretend to know. It's Facebook's business. They're much better at it than I am. I would have never done, could never have done what Zuckerberg's done. Zuckerberg's a genius for doing what he's done. He's brilliant. I mean, we can second guess him all we want. And we can say we don't like it. But to say they don't know what they're doing from a business perspective, Yes, Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter. YouTube, by the way, is owned by Google. Are all publicly traded, publicly owned. That doesn't mean the government owns them. It means shareholders own them. Shareholders can vote to kick out Zuckerberg and to put Alex Jones back on the platform. That's shareholders' business. So first, if you own Facebook shares and you want Alex Jones back on Facebook network, then go to the shareholders meeting and demand it and have a vote. Publicly owned doesn't mean the public owns them. It just means they're traded in the stock market and a bunch of people own them. And those people get to choose. And if they don't want Zuckerberg making these kind of decisions, they can fire Zuckerberg. The public doesn't own Facebook. Shareholders own Facebook. Internet resources are not public resources. They're private resources, private servers, private fiber optics cables. Who put those fiber optics cables across the United States, zigzagging all over the United States? Not the government, private companies. Yes, a part of the internet infrastructure was ultimately funded by government. Do you want, therefore, to say that because part of the internet infrastructure was created and is run by the government, that the government now gets to control the internet? That all companies on the internet platforms are now government entities and the government should regulate them and control them and dictate to them how they should act? Really? The government doesn't own anything. It pretends to own the frequency. It's stolen the frequency. Frequency is not owned by anybody. You want to own a particular frequency? Use it. That should have been, you should read Ayn Rand's article on exactly this frequency. And she says, one of the great travesties of a mixed economy is the government pretends to own this stuff and auctions it off or leases it to private users. That is bizarre. You should own it. Private entities should own all the frequencies. All the frequencies. They should be auctioned off, but ideally, there should have been a homesteading act over the frequencies. You use it, it's yours. Read Ayn Rand. It's in Capitalism, Not Known Ideal. It's about ownership of the airwaves. It's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant essay. What happens if everybody tries to use the same frequency? Well, what happens? What happens if everybody tries to use the same land? It goes to court, and a court of law decides who used it first, what radius, what geographic exposure. I mean, what happens if two people drill for the oil and hit the reserves at the same time? We have mechanisms. That's what a court system is for. We have mechanisms by which you arbitrate these issues. The solution is not for the government to own in quotes, the airwaves. That's how we get into these messes where the government now wants to regulate the internet because it owns the frequencies. That's a disaster. That's a disaster. Nobody owned land until people started using land and putting fences around it. Nobody owned the frequencies until people start using it and take ownership of it through their use. This is John Locke's concept of property rights. You mix your sweat with the soil. The same thing as with frequency. You mix your mind with the waves, with the frequency. And that's what creates private property. It has nothing to do with scarce resources. It has to do with property as something private individuals utilize. Read Ayn Rand's article. It plays it all out. Read the Austrian economist. Read Milton Friedman. There's no reason why there is a clash in the frequencies. Zero reason. All these things are said about every type of property right, and there's no problem to establish property rights over frequencies. I mean, there's some issues where it's difficult to establish property rights over the oceans. It's not easy. But to establish property rights over frequencies, easy, was written about in the 50s and 60s, done. There's no argument about that one anymore. All right. So, no, it's not censorship. No, the government has no role in playing it. No, I don't think this is a bad business decision necessarily. Just leave it alone. Let these internet companies do what they want. And if it's bad for business, they will suffer. If shareholders don't like it, they'll sell their stock or demand change in shareholder meetings. All right, again, we've got a question separating itself from the dollars. You guys have to get better at using the super chat. Have you heard of MRAs or men's rights activists? If so, what do you think of them? No, I haven't really, but I'm suspicious of any group that is somebody's rights activist. I don't like Black rights activists. I don't like women's rights activists. I don't like men's rights activists. I believe in individual rights. I believe in individual rights and fighting for individual rights, qua individuals, not qua group. There's no such thing as group rights. You have a rights as an individual, as a human being. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter what sex you are. It doesn't matter what sexual orientation you have. You have a right to your life. That is essentially all you need to know. Now, it's complicated how to apply that to all these legal spheres, but that's essentially what it is. And, that's what we should be fighting for, rather than men's rights or women's rights or gay rights or Black rights or yellow rights or green rights. It is individual rights. That's what's important. All right. I mean, I don't believe the government should own anything. I've said that before. I don't believe it should own land. I don't believe it should own buildings. I think it should sell everything. At best, the only property it might have to keep is the White House and Congress and maybe some military bases. And even in those cases, I would prefer that they lease it from private owners. Big business gets to hold all the frequency. Again, that's the stupid argument that people make about monopolies. It never works out. It never happens. It's not the way the world works. But yes, that's the argument against markets. Big business will own all the land. Big business will own all the telecom. Big business will own all the soybeans. Big business will own all the fill in the blank. Doesn't happen. Own all the oil, all the aluminum, all the mainframe computers. IBM was sued for that one. Study economics, guys. It's worthwhile. It's an important field, particularly before you have a strong opinion about these things. You should study economics. By the way, government does not own the land on the borders. That is not true. It owns some land on the borders, but it doesn't own all the land on the borders, and it shouldn't. Again, government shouldn't own land. Most of the border land in places like Texas, even in New Mexico, Arizona, is owned by private ranchers, private people. A lot of that land, half of it, some of it is in the US, some of it's in Mexico. I don't know about the Canadian border. That's a lot of wilderness. It could be that the government owns most of the land across the Canadian border because of its wilderness status, and property rights weren't well established in that part of the country, whereas in the South, because of ranching, property rights were well established in places like Texas. Going back a long time. These are massive ranches that exist on the border states. One of the problems with building a wall on the southern border is that you're going to have to use eminent domain to take a lot of private land to be able to build that wall on the private land. So I don't believe that the land police stations have should be owned by the government. I think it should all be leased from private citizens. And I've talked about this in a previous show. I think that keeps the government out of trouble. It keeps them out of the real estate business. It keeps them out of perverse incentives. And I think you get long-term leases for private owners for those things. But if all they owned were police stations and military bases and a few government buildings here and there, then it wouldn't be so bad. All right. And I'm against eminent domain. Eminent domain is all eminent domain I'm against. But that is for another time. I'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. Hopefully by then I'll have Facebook working. I don't know. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it's not working today. Hopefully it's just a glitch of either Facebook or Restream, and I'll get it fixed by tomorrow. So, but all of you on YouTube, you can catch me here. Same time, 8 p.m. East Coast time. The Yaron Brook show will be on tomorrow. I'm not sure what the topics will be. I'll decide sometime tomorrow. And of course, we'll be on Blog Talk Radio. Thanks, everybody, and I will see you tomorrow. And don't forget to share if you like the show, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and don't forget to support the show on Patreon. Bye, everybody. Talk to you tomorrow.